work sessions. A, Partnership for Housing Affordability Annual Update, Mr. Burton and Mr. Rogers.
Good afternoon. County Minister, I guess, is walking out, but Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you all for allowing us to provide another update. And I know many of you were at our annual event earlier this year and got to see kind of a regional overview of some of the work that's been happening as it relates to housing. And we'll drill a little bit further into the county. And particularly, we'll try to shed a little bit of light as much as we can, at least as far as potential impacts of any federal programs related to housing that a lot of our providers work with your residents to assist as it relates to housing. So we'll provide what we can. And Woody, I guess we'll just turn it over to you to start with some of the trends that we've seen lately as far as housing.
Sure. So I'm Woody Rogers, the Policy Director at Partnership for Housing Affordability. And just to give a little bit of an update about what we've been seeing over the past year regarding some trends. So as I'm sure you well know, Chesterfield is growing quite significantly. Just in the past year, the county has added nearly 26,000 residents to nearly 400,000 in total population. It's the largest growing county in the state in terms of total number of residents. It's also the sixth fastest growing county in the state and the only one above 175,000 population in the top 20 fastest growing counties. So we also know that 85% of that growth is driven by migration rather than natural increase, and a lot of that migration is coming from other parts of the region as well as other parts of the state. So the housing demand is certainly there, driven largely by this population growth that is expected to continue. And so as such, we've seen the median home sale price continue to rise, not quite as exponentially as it did in the years after 2020, but still it's at record highs. In 2024, it was nearly $413,000 as at the median sales price. And it's continued to rise since then. In January, the sales price rose to $424,000. So we're not seeing much of definitely no decline and not much really of a leveling. It's still sort of slightly increasing every month. So while we've seen that sales price increase by 43%, we've actually seen the income needed to afford the median sales price nearly double in the same time frame. And that's, of course, driven by, when you factor in things like mortgage rates, doubling or more than doubling since 2020, as well as increases to things like insurance costs. That means that, in order to afford that median sales price of $410,000, you would need to earn almost $124,000 as your household. And for reference, about 60% of current Chesterfield households cannot meet that income necessary to afford the median sales price. So, again, housing prices are continuing to rise and becoming less affordable to more households as things like median sales price and mortgage rates continue to be very high relative to historical trends. We've also seen rental prices increase since pre-pandemic levels. In order to afford the average rent in Chesterfield of around $1,500, a household would need to earn $60,000 to afford that. And when we say afford, we mean pay 30% of your income on housing or less. And so all that combined, we've seen housing cost burden, which is, again, households who are not able to afford their current housing using that 30% of their income threshold. We've seen it kind of rising when as before it was going lower. Now we're seeing the trend kind of reverse in recent years. So compared to the rest of the region, Chesterfield doesn't have as many households living in currently unaffordable housing to them right now, but it's still a high rate. So, especially with renters, we're seeing 47% of renter households are paying too much for their housing. For homeowners, it's around 20%. And when Chesterfield being the largest county in our region, that amounts to over 20,000 owner households and 15,000 renter households paying too much for their housing right now. Furthermore, when you're looking at extreme housing cost burden, which we define as households paying 50% of their income or more on housing costs, we're looking at 1 in 4 renter households paying half of their income and 1 in 10 owner households. So a lot of households in very unstable situations paying much more of their income than they should be on housing costs alone because of those price increases. And we can see some of those trends in real time through our housing resource line, which residents can call in for housing assistance and connecting to different housing resources. In 2024, we saw some increases compared to last year in terms of the total number of calls. I'll also point out in the summer, I think July 2024 was the highest number of calls coming from Chesterfield residents that we've seen since 2022. So the number of people who need resources for housing is increasing to levels not seen since really the sort of the middle part of the pandemic.
And if I may just contextualize the ebbs and flows throughout the year a little bit. Normally, this time of year, we see fewer calls from residents just because when it's around tax season and folks have a greater ability to pay for things related to rent or to cover any costs that may be unexpected. So we usually see an uptick in the summer, and particularly around the start of the school year. That's usually when we're going to see the biggest increase in calls.
It's also a time when I think leases commonly end in July or August. So, those sorts of things impact, people having to move and pay things like security deposits, as well as just finding affordable housing that they can live in and find. We also know that, as I just kind of mentioned, some of the most prominent needs are for financial assistance that we hear about. So that's, again, things like security deposits, payment for rent and utilities, and then rental options, which is just looking for units that would be affordable to their household on the market as they exist. Basically 80% or more of our callers are calling about those two categories solely. We also know that, for most of the callers that we get through the housing resource line, they are in pretty serious situations, behind on rent and or utilities. So these are households in pretty unstable housing and are kind of a paycheck or less away from potentially losing that housing. And then lastly, I'll just point out where we're seeing most of these callers come in the county, largely sort of in the eastern portion of Chesterfield, especially around the Route 1 corridor and the southern border with the city of Richmond, around Chippenham Parkway. That's sort of the point in time look at the county, and there has been progress, if I can get there, that I'll let Jovan talk about some.
Yeah, and I know that you all have heard some of these numbers and figures, but just a regional perspective of what's happening. There is a lot of development taking place, particularly within this sector. So we have over 3,100 affordable rental units that are in the pipeline. That's a combination of for-profit and nonprofit partners who are participating towards that. We're seeing less and less senior housing get developed, despite the significant increases that we have in the senior population. So I would just point that out as a concern from a development standpoint. We're not seeing that nearly as much as we used to, and I think partly it's some of the programs that are designed to construct this housing really doesn't incentivize it the way that it used to. So that would be one that I would point out that's really noteworthy for the county as far as development. And then what we're also doing is really trying to encourage the corporate sector here across the region to play a more outsized role as it relates to housing. And I think there's been a recognition that the public sector, particularly at the local level, has been very involved in this issue over recent years. But there's still a need, particularly at the private and corporate sector level, to see a greater role played there. So we created this corporate playbook, and I wish I had some copies for you all today, but we ran out at our event, so we need to do another run of that. But they've been very receptive to this thus far, and I think the conversations that have been had really are trying to identify what role they need to play and filling gaps that maybe the public sector and philanthropy aren't able to do. So I think that's where we're going to start, and we've had some encouraging conversations with willing corporate partners thus far, and hopefully we can encourage a few more of them to join the conversation in the coming months. So I'll just get into a few items that I really think are pertinent, and I'll just kind of go directly to local dollars that typically come from the federal government that the county is entitled to. CDBG, won't use the alphabet soup, but Community Development Block Grant, home and emergency solutions grants. Those support a lot of our nonprofit partners who do things like home rehab, home repairs for low-income folks, particularly for seniors. And it's really been a lifeline for many decades. And, I think there's just a little bit of uncertainty as to, where that funding exists. And for the county, the average from the last few fiscal years that you all have been entitled to is around $2.2 million. So that's where that would stand. And, I think that there's a lot of conversations in this space as to, the impact that would have locally, regionally, and we'll do our best to kind of coordinate with you all as far as just kind of localizing what the impact would be for your residents. And then the other thing I wanted to point to is just related to opportunities at the local level. So we've seen some really interesting things happen over the last few months as it relates to incentives and different zoning processes that allow for just different types of housing. And I think one that you all may have seen in the news recently was Henrico recently allowed a smaller lot size use, I think as low as 3,000 square feet, to encourage some building plans that builders have that would be smaller homes that are certainly more cost effective to build than your traditional single family that you're seeing get built today. Those numbers that Woody shared a little bit earlier around median sales price and new construction, that's just partially the reality of development today, but encouraging smaller lot sizes is one way that you could help address that at the local level. And, I think that that's something that there's some plans out there that the building community would certainly be receptive towards that. So there are some opportunities at the local level that I think, the county's current process would allow for. And, we encourage you all to continue to engage in these conversations to explore that. But happy to close there and just open it up to any questions that you all may have, whether it's things we talked about today or did not. Thank you.
Board members, any questions, comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I saw that same article in the Times-Dispatch. I was wondering if you could answer a question around that. They said that, yes, they were thinking about making smaller lot size, urbanization, those kind of things. But they also, in the article, said they weren't sure that it was going to really create affordable housing, given other issues related to getting the materials and those kind of things. I was curious if you could speak on that.
Yeah, that's a great question because inherently it doesn't reduce the cost of development, right? The materials still cost what they cost. The thinking is that certainly those would be homes that would not be at your typical price point that you're seeing now in some of the larger lots. And not only that, it's the 3,000 square feet and it's the 10 units per acre. So enabling them to take advantage of the increased density and economies of scale would theoretically help reduce some of the price points. Now, obviously, there still has to be a willingness on the development side, but I don't think it's a silver bullet.
So I definitely agree with you and have voiced some concern about the HUD funding coming through. Have you heard anything in your organization as far as, because I know that HUD just fired like 50 people last week. So again, is this, have you heard anything about the funding for those grants?
We hear it in bits and pieces. I think some of the most recent notices that we've heard, some reductions in staff at the Richmond field office for HUD, which are really the point people for a lot of our nonprofits who have grants that need administration. And I think that the challenge there is that they'll tell you, when someone goes on vacation at that office, it significantly delays their ability to, administer that grant. And so if those individuals aren't there, I think there's just concerns on the ease at which they'd be able to draw down some of that funding. And then I think from the standpoint of, funding that's been allocated for developments, what happens if some of that is paused or tied up and they're not able to close on their financing, and does this delay deals that are 3-4 years out to being even further out? So that's what we're still trying to make sense of with some of our partners.
And looking at the numbers that you put, especially in the increased assessed values of houses or market value of houses, right? So some people understand it, some people don't, but it's market driven, right? So you look at the numbers that Weldon Cooper is showing between the last census data right now and 2025, we've seen almost 30,000 plus people move into Chesterfield County. we have had, the reason they could move here, because we actually had units available for them to move to. If we didn't have new construction or apartments going up or townhomes going up, they wouldn't be able to move here. So, I mean, I think our challenge here for us is being able to maintain our infrastructure along with the new development, which has always been a challenge here, trying to make sure that we have the schools, which we're now finally building, the road improvements, all of that. We actually approved a small house product, and that development, they walked away from it, actually. And of course, part of it is, when you look at this, is land cost. When the developer has to come in and buy the land, and then how much is it going to cost to put utilities in, to put water in, to put sewer in, to put roads in, all of that, which it makes it very challenging for us to get the price point down. And even if we did, it's still market-driven, which means if you build a 1,000-square-foot house and someone's still willing to pay $300,000 for it, they're going to pay $300,000 for it. So I appreciate your presentation, and I'm glad that we shared this with the whole Richmond region, because this is a bigger problem, and it's not just here. It's all across the United States right now. And there are housing problems everywhere. And the reason I wanted to say this is because a lot of people may be watching this don't understand. They think that the county assesses the value, and therefore it goes through the roof, and it's our fault. Our assessments are based on market, on what the actual product sells for, and actually we assess below market when we do our stuff. So thank you for being here, because it's important to have someone like yourself come here and explain these things so the community can see it and clarify what actually drives some of this.
And I will just say, I think on the supply side, just it will vary locality to locality. I mean, I think we were presenting to Henrico recently, and I think they only have around 2.6 months of supply. Just means if development completely stopped, that's how long it would take to sell all the homes in the market. And typically you want around 6 months of supply, and that hasn't happened there since 2012. So
That supply
that's going to
is
continue
based
to
on
drive.
demand. So, I mean, right now, for example, if the market dries up, where people, which we did see it slow down a little bit because of the increases in loan rates, but it's really about the demand. So, we've seen a short window here because we've had so many people wanting to move here. That window could shift the other way if people stop buying houses.
Certainly. And I think, and I'll just speak from our nonprofit partner standpoint, I know we probably have to keep moving, but the challenges that they're facing right now with a lot of the clients they're working with who are receiving down payment assistance, closing cost assistance, if you will, they get out there and there's no product for them. And it's great to have that assistance, but if they can't be competitive with all cash buyers or investors, that makes it much more challenging.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, you point out some very interesting issues that I've seen for many years. And my colleagues and I have discussed the possibility of waiving fees, of doing everything the county can do to help with, but we don't control the market in that respect, nor do we control developers and how they perceive and handle products. We've had many discussions in that area. What I'm hoping for, because this is somewhat of a crisis, is a comprehensive strategy, state, federal, that can work toward this problem. No one county, I believe, can solve it wholly, but rather in a comprehensive way, looking at together we can work toward a solution out of this crisis, if you will. You may recall the housing crisis that we experienced during the last Great Recession. We had way too many houses, foreclosures and the like. And so, again, thanks for the information, but I believe that we have to do it comprehensively. Thank you for your presentation.
And you mentioned something that we're dealing with now with Henrico, and that with the regulatory environment we are, is that it's voluntary. There's nothing compelling the development or building community to do this work. And if there are going to be fee waivers, I think the condition we've had with a lot of them through that program is there needs to be a dollar for dollar reduction in the price point passed on to the buyer. And so if that's something that you all would be considering, I think that would be a key requirement that would need to be in place.
Well, I mean, the way we work that out, Mr. Chair, is with the Maggie Walker Land Trust, with what we do at Ettrick Landing, which we all featured in your presentation. And that was a unique situation where we were able to donate the county land and then work with other grant programs to supplement what the cost would be. Now, that's the first of its kind in the United States, and it's only 10 houses. It's a much bigger challenge if you decide now we want to do 50 or do 100. Trying to find funds to actually offset all of that is more challenging. And you really, as Mr. Holland said, you have to get a builder, a developer who's going to agree to a price point up front.
I know we're running a little bit long, but I do have a few questions and comments. The affordable house definition, when people hear that, many people think different things. I think you touched on it to a certain point. Can you afford your rent or your mortgage with 30% or less of your income being used to pay that amount? And I think it's important for citizens to hear that that's what we're talking about, because affordable, if you make $65,000, $70,000 a year, that's still, I don't remember what the exact number is on that, but finding a unit that will allow you to move in is still difficult. So it's not like we're talking about people that are making $10,000 a year that have no real income. We're talking about people at all levels and all types of positions, including our law enforcement, our teachers, our nurses, our bankers. I mean, really, we're talking about a large swath of the community. So I just think it's important for people to hear that when we use the term affordable. The growth rate, I would just say that I believe your one slide, you showed like 26,000 in 1 year, and I believe that's from 2020 to 2024, not in 1 year, because our actual growth rate is approximately 2%, which I know would probably surprise many people in the county, because when I ask them how fast they think we're growing at anywhere from 10 to 20%, and we're really growing at about 2%. So I think it's important for people to know that 2% of 380,000 is a higher number than 2% of 200,000, but it's still a healthy growth rate. So we need to keep that in mind, because if you're not growing at all, then you have lots of problems. We've seen that in other jurisdictions. And to Mr. Carroll's point, home values are going up because we still have a high demand. To your point, we don't have a parity in seller and buyer situation. It's still leaning towards the seller's market. That's why the home values are going up so much. That's why assessments have gone up so much over the last few years. And as far as assessments go, the county doesn't get to choose. We have a method that's prescribed by the state that we have to use. So to Mr. Carroll's point, that's why assessments come in where they do, because that's based on the actual market rate, not what you paid for it, even if you bought your house 35 years ago. And we do have some people in the county that did, and are in a tough spot because their costs for insurance and taxes are higher than they paid for their mortgage until they paid their mortgage off. So all of that does have to be taken into consideration when we make our policy on the Board of Supervisors. Thank you again for coming out and sharing.
Thank you.